the Westdale and another one of our live film talks. I hope everyone can hear and see me okay. The chat is open, and if anyone could just confirm that my voice and video are appearing properly, that would be great. And of course, I'd love to hear from you as we talk. And at the end of the talk, I will be answering questions as appropriate. Good. Okay, so this is our sixth talk already, sixth film talk. It's hard to believe time seems to be zooming by. And I want to thank last week Colin Doncaster, who gave a fantastic talk about The Lord of the Rings and about his experiences in New Zealand working on the film and working with Peter Jackson. And it was just incredible story. And we will have other guests like that who will come. And in fact, Colin's going to come back again and do another one for us. And he's going to tell us some more incredible stories about some projects he's been involved in. But tonight we're going to talk about one of my favorite films. And it's such a pleasure to kind of rewatch these films after many years. Many of them are probably films you guys have seen as well. But during this time, we have a lot of time. It's fun to watch them again with a new perspective and a different way of thinking about them. And certainly I notice new things every time I see them. And also just a reminder that the Westdale, our theater is closed, but we're also running we're up to 10 film clubs now. And these are small 10, 12 person 1 hour meetings where you watch a film during the week and then you get together and chat about it. It's much more interactive. And if you're interested in joining a film club, there's room for people, and there are more film clubs starting. There's always a great moderator who can help talk about the film and guide the conversation. And you can find about that at thewestdale.ca. So let's jump into Lawrence of Arabia. I was so struck watching this movie, and how was it possible that here we are watching one of the greatest cinematic achievements of all time? The scale of the production, the photography, all the craft work. Remember, this director, David Lean, of course, is one of the greatest directors who ever lived, nominated for 7 Academy Awards. The spectacle, and of course, the locations were extraordinary. And remember, this was done, before there were any visual effects. There was no, digital effects. There may be a few matte paintings, but most of this movie was live. You were seeing the real people, no duplicating crowds, and the action is just extraordinary as well, and how they achieved that is an amazing story. But even with all of that going forward, and of course that's why people remember it, I think, what this movie is really about is it's a very small, intimate, and personal character study of this extraordinary man. And how that could coexist in the midst of this giant spectacle is just an amazing achievement. And I think that I'll be talking a lot about that, because that, I think, is what impressed me the most. And of course, even more interesting is that as complex, because it was a very complex character, T.E. Lawrence, it's ultimately, it's not defined, and none of the questions are actually answered. And it's actually, very much a subject of interpretation for the audience, and something that you're really left thinking about. What was your impression of this man and what he achieved, and at what cost, and what motivated him. And I think that's part of the reason there's this enduring interest in this film. This film is always rated one of the 10 greatest movies ever made, Even at the time, people certainly recognized it. It's often referred to as a mythic blockbuster because when it came out, a stunning epic and a sensitive portrait of one of the greatest romantic legends of the 20th century. And of course, T.E. Lawrence was a great hero to the British people and to others, but he also was quite a mythical hero. The movie's loosely based on a book that he wrote himself called The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. But Lawrence died at 47 years old. And I think that's part of the myth, you know, is that, and we've seen this when others die young, like JFK or actors like James Dean. Our memories of them are different because of the fact that they, you know, had that short life, and we're left to remember them in their greatest moments. Another critic called it an epic tragedy worthy of Homer, dances on the boundary between history and myth. Leans investigates a mysticism, negating any kind of realism, and places the film in a dreamlike world of Lawrence's head to explore the personal struggle out of which he achieved so much, but also ultimately failed. So, you know, this is really the story of this film and what interests me the most about it. The book that Lawrence wrote was not historically accurate necessarily. It was Lawrence's own interpretation of the events and his actions and why. And of course, before we get into the movie, I thought it'd be interesting just to share a little information about the man himself, because the real Lawrence was a bastard son. His father was a wealthy landowner, Thomas Chapman, who left his family to go live with his pregnant governess, you know, and she gave birth to this son, and they had a few other children, but they were never, you know, given the name Chapman. They were never recognized for anything other than they were. You remember, this was a very strict British, you know, upper class society at the time. The name Lawrence actually might have come from his mother's father, but we're not really sure because the mother herself was a bastard child and the father never truly recognized Lawrence's mother. So throughout his life, he actually had many different names, last names as well, but Lawrence was the one he was mostly known by. He wound up going to Oxford. He did, you know, he was financed by his father. He became an archaeologist. He did travel quite a bit in Arabia in his archaeological work, and he became the protege of an incredible woman named Gertrude Bell. I'm only mentioning her because if you don't know her, her story is equally fascinating. A single woman who graduated from Oxford at the time, very unusual, who traveled throughout the desert in the Middle East and found and met Bedouins in the middle of, anyhow, extraordinary story. Queen of the Desert. There's a wonderful book about her, Gertrude Bell, and they actually made a film about her that starred Nicole Kidman, directed by Werner Herzog, and unfortunately it's pretty terrible. I don't know how with that talent involved. But anyhow, he did know quite a bit about Arabia and had traveled there, so you know, naturally he did, you know, become involved with the Arab desk as shown in the movie. Though, interestingly enough, Lawrence actually was never really supposed to be in the Army at all because he was only 5'5" and didn't qualify. You had to be 5'6" to join the Army. And then, of course, there's an irony in that Peter O'Toole was 6'2", and although people claim they did have some resemblance, certainly not in terms of height. So, you know, and of course, when the film came out, it was a huge success. It's 7 Oscars. It won 7 out of 10 nominations. Its enduring appeal, of course, is the exhilarating, you know, exotic adventure. It was controversial, of course, because, again, the accuracy of some of the events that are shown in the film and during the Arab Rebellion were not necessarily completely accurate. And also, of course, this sort of personal story was somewhat disjointed and did not have a satisfactory conclusion. So the critics really weren't quite sure what to make of it, but it did win Best Picture, Best Director. The only thing it didn't win was Best Actor for Peter O'Toole. This was the year of To Kill a Mockingbird, and Gregory Peck won for Best Actor. In terms of spectacle cinema at its best, well, of course, this movie was highly influential for Steven Spielberg and Scorsese. Spielberg talks about it as one of his favorite film, and and influenced his filmmaking quite a bit. They've actually paid for the restoration of the film. George Lucas was obviously influenced it by the film, perhaps by the music. If you listen to the score of Star Wars, it certainly has some aspects of what was achieved by Maurice Jarre in this incredible score. It was shot, and I remember this is 1962, so this was a period when television was really taking off, and that the idea was let's we got to make films bigger and better to get people to come to the movie theater. It was shot in something was called Super Panavision at the time. So they used spherical lenses instead of anamorphic ones. The image was exposed on a 65 millimeter negative and then printed on a 70 millimeter positive. So there was room for, the soundtrack, incredible soundtrack. And trying to imagine, what it'd be like to go to a movie palace and to see this film when it first, with an overture, before the film even image appears, and then of course an intermission, and of course it was a different style of filming, which was really required because of the giant image. You often shot with longer and more fluid takes. You couldn't do the kind of rapid cutting that you might have done in film before then. It's such a wide ratio that there are even some issues about movement that you have to understand in terms of blocking actors and having them move at a diagonal instead of across the screen to avoid flutters. But David Lean was, obviously a total master. And people would ask him, it seems so difficult. He says, if one has an eye for our composition, there'll be no problem. And there certainly wasn't. This was a very long movie, as you know, and there were one or two different cuts where they took some minutes out, put minutes back, and this and that. But the ultimate version was actually 1 minute longer than Gone with the Wind. So it is the longest movie that ever won an Academy Award. And we'll talk about some other aspects of the filmmaking later. But again, what I'm really interested in this story was this story of identity, sort of, conflict, do I fit in? Where do I fit in? As he would talk in the film, can I just be ordinary? But Lawrence never did fit in. He was driven, he had vision, but he also had grave doubts, and he was always trying to be or find a place where he could be part of. There was definitely challenges in his real life regarding homosexuality, which is not terribly explored in this movie. It was explored quite in a greater degree in a play, a very successful play that had come out years before. Actually, where starring Alec Guinness as T.E. Lawrence. When this movie came, he was too old, but he actually had played Lawrence. He had Lawrence had a strange relationship with violence, especially violence with himself. He clearly had some masochistic tendencies that are subtextual in the movie, but appear to be true in real life. Ultimately, this is sort of, this story reminds me sometimes of Citizen Kane, one of the greatest movies. Who is the man? And that's the question of Citizen Kane, and in some ways that's the question of this film as well. And if you think about the very beginning of the film, we open, with this, accidental death in the motorcycle crash, very dramatic and action, and then we're at the steps of the funeral, right? And we have a reporter, asking for different appraisals of the great Lawrence, and he gets all these different stories. One, he was a poet, a scholar, a mighty warrior. Another guy says he was, the most shameless exhibitionist since Barnum and Bailey. Someone else describes him as a minor functionary on the Arab desk. By the end of the picture, though, we find that sort of each assessment is true, but all these observations are really just sort of scratching, at the surface of the question. We're not really, really sure. Another great moment related to this, of course, is when, Lawrence, crosses the Suez Canal. He needs to get to Cairo to report the success of the attack on Aqaba. And they finally make it to the waterway, and we see a man, puttering along on the motorcycle, and he sees Lawrence and the boy, and barely standing. They're obviously, and the man shouts out. He says, "Who are you?" And the story, of course, is that's actually David Lean's voice. That he wanted to be the one asking this important question, and Lawrence does not answer. And so it's sort of interesting that this is something that Lean wanted to do. But again, we have to talk a little bit about David Lean, because, of course, this was a very personal film for him, and all his films, of course, were very personal films. One of the greatest British directors, of course, ever. He started off very humble beginnings. They talk about starting as a gopher. Well, his first job was as a tea boy on a set, and was not a successful student, gravitated to the film industry. Interestingly, he had Quaker parents, which grew up in a very nonviolent tradition, though many of his films have a lot of violence. He worked his way up to become a film editor, and was a very successful film editor in England. And many, not many, but often film editors do become directors. And of course, editing is such a critical part. And all of Lean's films, including this one, are known for some of their very unusual and brilliant editing. He had made a number of really wonderful smaller films in England, including Brief Encounter, 1945, which won the Grand Prix at Cannes, and is still considered one of the 10 best English films ever. And then he went on to begin to do these large-scale epics. And the first, of course, was Bridge Over the River Kwai in 1957, which also won many Academy Awards, and based on the famous story of the British and American prisoners trying to survive the British camp. And then later on, his biggest success, of course, was Dr. Zhivago. And what he seems to be fascinated by is it's sort of this consistently tragic vision, of a romantic sensibility, attempting to reach beyond the constraints and restrictions of sort of everyday life. So we often see in his films these sort of intimate stories of a close-knit group of characters whose fates are indirectly but powerfully shaped by history-shaking events going on all around them. And Lawrence was in this movie was determined to do the impossible, and of course we ultimately find him to be a somewhat deluded and self-obsessed and dogmatic man doomed by his inner conflicts. And this is sort of a reoccurring theme in David Lean's films. And they never refusing to accept defeat when all reasonable chance for victory is compromised. It's that quality that makes them so great, but also makes them quite mad. And I think that, in truth, was a quality that David Lean had himself. He was a difficult man to work with, a perfectionist. He tried, he wanted to control every film, every frame of the film. He was, very committed and obsessed, not unlike many other great directors, but it does take that kind of personality to achieve what they can sometimes achieve. And, he would often only shoot 2 hours a day, just at magic hour, because, that's what the image was that he needed. And of course, his best films are personal and resonated with his personal conflicts, An incredible story during the filming of this, Lean was shooting, of course, in the desert for, days and days and days and days, and sort of refused to, take proper shelter or acknowledge the sort of brutality of the filming itself. And it got so bad, in fact, that he had, after the shoot, he had to have surgery to remove sand that, had gotten all trapped inside his eyelids. And, again, it's not completely clear about these masochistic desires that he might have had, but this process of sort of putting yourself in a situation that is in some way comparable to the one in the film is something we see with other directors, but it seems like it was a very desirable and necessary component for Lean in some of his most powerful work. He really was not overly articulate about his work and what he did, but the one expression or that he's best known for when people asked him, what do you do as a filmmaker? It was be bold, that was, and take chances. His partner on this film was equally fascinating. The producer was a man named Sam Spiegel, and Sam Spiegel was quite extraordinary guy. European, came to America, and he was one of the first financiers who actually would finance movies outside of the traditional Hollywood studio system. He always used the studios to distribute the movies, but he had sources of financing, would put together financing, and this was really a time when this was starting to evolve in the 50s and 60s. The idea of these independent producers who had the power and the access to money to do things differently. And of course, he won 3 Academy Awards for Best Picture, which is kind of extraordinary. The first was actually On the Waterfront, Elia Kazan's movie. And then he partnered with Lean on Bridge over the River Kwai, which was the highest grossing film of 1957, 7 Academy Awards. And then, of course, this film as well, Lawrence of Arabia, which he also won Best Picture, as the best producer. And kind of an amazing story. And we could talk a long time about Sam Spiegel, but if you're interested, that would be good. So this was really what happened. And Spiegel, was the one who did option the book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and, which inspired maybe most of the first half. The second half was certainly a lot of invention. And of course, there were many, many other characters that were not necessarily real, but composition of multiple characters. The script development's kind of interesting. The original script was written by Michael Wilson, who also had written the Bridge over the River Kwai. But Michael Wilson was a blacklisted writer, so he could not get credit, never was able to receive credit for Bridge over the River Kwai until much later. He also wrote a fantastic script for Gentleman's Agreement, another Academy Award-winning movie. Was not able to get credit. And of course, he was not able to be given a credit on this film as well. But he wrote the original draft of the screenplay. But Lean was not very happy with it because it really focused on the historical and political aspects of the Arab Revolt. And very complicated and long, it would have been even longer than this movie. So instead, he brought in a younger writer named Robert Bolt. And Bolt came from theater. And Bolt had written a wonderful play called A Man for All Seasons, which was also made into a great film by Fred Zinnemann. And he was brought in to rewrite the script and really to fulfill what Lean wanted, which was this to be more of a character study of Lawrence. So, although Wilson, really did the basis of it, virtually all the dialogue in the finished film was written by Bolt, and really Bolt was the one who should properly have been and did get the recognition, but and I think later on there may have been some recognition of Michael Wilson's involvement. But Bolt was a great dramatist, and so many little features, that feel scripted and were scripted. Shots of the motorcycle goggles hanging on the tree branch after the crash, and you'll even notice at the end when Lawrence is starting to go home, a motorcycle passes by him, and and sort of bringing you back to the beginning of the film and reminding you of the character. But it was an incredible script, an incredible amount of work to obviously put this all together. I think it was about 2 years in development, the script itself and the pre-production. One of the films that clearly influenced Lean, and he talked about it a lot, was John Ford's The Searchers, and that helped him develop a lot of ideas to how to shoot the film. And if you don't know The Searchers, it's one of the greatest westerns that was ever made. And John Ford, of course, was the greatest western director. And if certainly there are moments like Sharif's Ali entrance at the well, where we see this little speck on the horizon that slowly grows bigger and bigger. That's certainly a shot that he emulated from Ford, and many directors have emulated since. In fact, David Lean, he originally had the shot lasting almost like 2.5 minutes, and he finally chickened out and cut it down to about 30 seconds or 40 seconds, but it does seem to go on forever. But and certainly some of the other use of landscape was very much inspired by Ford. The scenes in Wadi Rum, certainly resembled Monument Valley in many ways, where many of Ford's westerns were shot. And it's just interesting to see how great directors are influenced by the people who came before them, and then of course they inspire a whole nother generation. Casting of the movie is always, as you know, so complicated, difficult. Alec Guinness, of course, had worked with David Lean several times and had starred in, Bridge Over the River Kwai, and had played, Lawrence and Ross in this play. But, and although they didn't get along very well at all, they had huge problems working together. They both recognized each other's brilliance. And he decided to take over, and Guinness did agree to play, of course, Prince Faisal. Is that how you say it? Prince Faisal. And although it was originally supposed to be played by Laurence Olivier, who dropped out, and Guinness stepped in to play that part, and is almost difficult to recognize at first, And then for Lawrence, the other contender who actually they really wanted for the film was Albert Finney. And in fact, they actually shot, I believe, for a day or two with Albert Finney, who was a little better known, but ultimately Peter O'Toole, of course, got the part. He was 28 at the time, and he had done some good work in theaters. So although he was unknown in the film world, he was certainly known as a very talented up-and-coming actor. The first choice of the producer, Sam Spiegel, was Marlon Brando, who he worked with on The Waterfront, and it's sort of interesting to think what this film might have been like with Marlon Brando playing the part. But Peter O'Toole obviously made this perhaps his greatest part ever. One comment about him was that he was so beautiful, though it was almost distracting. In fact, Noel Coward said if he was any prettier, they would have had to call it Florence of Arabia. But he was amazing in it. Omar Sharif, first time people had seen Omar Sharif. He was a successful actor. He had been in a number of films in Egypt and was certainly well known, but he never was going to. In fact, he was originally cast to be the guide. He was Lawrence's guide at the beginning, who brings him to Prince Faisal. And only when none of the Anglo actors worked out for the part of Ali was he given the part. Alec Guinness actually based his accent on conversations with Omar Sharif. And of course, David Lean had made a great discovery, because 3 years later, he would use Omar Sharif again, of course, in Dr. Zhivago, which was one of the most successful commercial films of all time. So quite an interesting group of actors. And of course, Anthony Quinn, a Mexican actor, incredible career. We could talk about him for a long time. One thing I did not know was that his first success was actually in theater, not on film. And he was the actor who replaced Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire. And was very successful on Broadway and in Chicago with that play. And that's how Elia Kazan found him and of course cast him in Via Zapata, which is a fantastic movie, and was the movie that sort of made him a star. And Quinn loved playing this part, and particularly loved his prosthetic nose, and he became quite obsessed with the real character he was playing. Jose Ferrara was a very big star, at the time, and he plays, the Turkish Colonel Bey. Very small part, but he actually got paid more than O'Toole and Omar Sharif combined, and he got a Porsche to be in the movie. But it was a very important scene for David Lean. He's in the movie for 5 minutes, but even O'Toole, says he learned more about screen acting from Ferrara than any acting class if you don't know his work. He also won an Academy Award for art did in 1950 for Cyrano de Bergerac. Arthur Kennedy, the American, Jackson Bentley. Now, this was pretty well known that this was based on a real journalist named Lowell Thomas, a very famous New York journalist. And in fact, at one point, there was some thought about his role even being more prominent, and there was going to be a movie star. In fact, Kirk Douglas was interested in playing the part, and Edmund O'Brien. But what actually turned up happening was that his role ultimately became smaller as time goes on, and it was really only the very last minute that Arthur Kennedy got the part. So again, when we think about spectacle, well, it took way longer to make this film than the actual Arab Rebellion took. The Arab Rebellion was 2 years, but this was 2 years just to prep, then another year and a half of shooting and another year of post. The crew was over 200 people with, cast and extras. Over 1,000 people were probably working on it to make this film. It was shot in Jordan mainly, but also in Morocco and in Spain. And in fact, all the interiors were done in Seville. They did not shoot in Cairo or in Egypt at all. And of course, no visual effects. People are real, horses are real. They actually built the city of Aqaba, which is kind of amazing. That wonderful scene for the attack that was, built actually in Spain, in the desert. Incredible production people involved. The cinematographer, of course, was Freddie Young. He won the 3 Academy Awards. He won for this and for Dr. Zhivago and also Orion's Daughter, all movies he made with David Lean, one of the greatest, British photographers of all time. Fantastic production design, of course. It was a guy named John Box. He won an Academy Award for this, and then later won for Dr. Zhivago. David Lean was like many directors. Once he found someone fantastic, he would just, make them part of his team and would use them for film after film. And these, he really had the best of the best. The costume designer, Phyllis Dalton, she won an Academy Award later for Dr. Zhivago. And then a new collaborator for this film was the composer, Maurice Jarre, French composer. I believe the composer for River Kwai may have passed away, so he had to find someone new. And this is a very memorable film score, and the way he uses the cymbals and the haunting strings, and really captures the mysticism and mystery of the desert. It's hard to imagine, this film without the score. And it really added, this kind of incredibly lavish quality and epic quality. And Jarre would, he won Academy Award for this, and he would continue to score all of David Lean's films from then on, including, of course, Dr. Zhivago and the famous Lara's theme. And I think a big influence on many of the contemporary composers. Certainly, John Williams and some of his scores are, certainly I feel have some resonance with what was attempted, and very bold and very, and very important, giving the music a real important role out front, and not just, a supporting role in terms of telling the story. Again, the film itself, the opening is just, to me, extraordinary. I don't know why I'd sort of forgotten the opening. I didn't remember it started with showing his death, and what an incredible scene of him riding on that motorcycle. He seems to have this smile on his face, as if he's sort of courting death, or he's looking for his. It's a very, very powerful scene, I think, and of course it started with action and sets up immediately the mystery of this film, and why was he driving so recklessly, and again, so many great moments. And then, of course, right after that, the funeral, where we meet the characters. We meet, Colonel Brighton and General Murray and Allenby and the reporter. And these are all, of course, the characters we're going to see throughout the movie. And here we are meeting them all in the very first scene. It's quite fascinating, and hearing, all of these different, statements, and, these, the thesis of what you think the film's going to be about, and then an antithesis, and it really sets up a wonderful and ultimately true, exploration as to who this character is. There were so many early moments that help establish him. He's playing with the candle is one of my favorite moments. The trick is not minding when it hurts. What does that tell you immediately about this character? And of course, there's so many times, when he uses the landscape and the transitions from, fire to, from a match to a sunset, and it's just incredible to me how, although it's this very, very long movie, I felt transported away. I never felt, I really was able to, go with this film and have this incredible journey into the desert and with this character. And, it didn't seem long to me, that attack on Aqaba is just an extraordinary sequence, and it's very interesting. They attack left to right. That's a very well-known convention from Westerns. The cowboys always attack left to right, and the Indians always go right to left. I'm not really sure where that came from and who first started to do it that way. Maybe that's because the way we read. I don't know, but I think of course, it's true. And if you look at films, you'll see this is often done. And of course, Lean did it in this movie as well. And although the attack is not terribly violent, and it doesn't take very long either, but it's done with such beautiful camera work, and it's just absolutely extraordinary to me. And it actually was pretty dangerous. Lawrence was not a good camel rider, but he would often, be asked to do things on the set. And in fact, during that attack, he almost died because he fell off his camel and could have been trampled. But the camels, I guess, know to stand over their rider when they fall, and somehow he was protected and was not hurt. But I understand it was pretty crazy. And then, Seville, those were not sets. Those were actual locations, incredible locations. And again, with the super Panavision and the sweeping camera and those long walks through the hallways, and especially that wonderful moment when he takes his servant, boy to the bar, when they arrive from crossing the Sinai. It's just absolutely extraordinary to me, the scale and the epic scale that this was done. Let's see. And now, again, this whole idea of the desert, and what was this fascination that this character and the real character, what is it about the desert, where I guess, a guy who is by nature a loner or not sure of his identity. So what is the desert? A place where, a man who feels alone among his own kind can be in control, because it's just him and nature, lose himself in a fantasy he desires. He really creates this identity for himself that wasn't, or may not even really be true. In fact, there's a great line by Dryden. He says, only two kinds of creatures get fun in the desert: Bedouins and gods, and you are neither. Get along in the desert. Bedouins and gods, and you are neither. For ordinary men, it's a burning, firing furnace. So that's the question. Is Lawrence ordinary? Is he just an ordinary man? Or does he perceive himself as a god or some special quality? So this is this journey of self-discovery he goes through, and it's quite dramatic. And we see him go, and especially of course after he's captured, and it's quite extraordinary to see what happens. And then at the end, we're still not even sure, But this is a character, obviously he's probing his own sense of self and trust. Even at the beginning, he gives his gun to the guide. He will, drink only when the guide drinks. He recognizes what, of course, you know, in American mythological literature, they talk about all the time, you know, how to defeat the Indians, you had to go Indian and fight their way, or, you know, the best lawmen in the West were always, you know, the guys who were the gunfighters and criminals first. And you know, and this was Lawrence losing himself in this new identity he was trying to create, and in this world in the desert with these Bedouins. And I love the writing. You know, there's this wonderful moment, of course, when Gazim, you know, is falls off his camel and is left behind, and he turns to Ali, and Lawrence is so upset that they've gone on without him, and the answer is it is written, you know, and then of course this is an amazing sequence when Hasselin cuts back and forth between the sun and the searing white and Lawrence, you know, riding and riding, and the hero worshiping boy keeping vigil, and then he ultimately, you know, emerges with Gazim, and of course this is the moment when he really becomes accepted. And of course he gasps, "Nothing is written," and passes out. But this is, of course, you know, after this strong stare, you know, from Ali. Ali hands him his water. This is like, you know, he's sort of accepting, breaking bread with him. They, you know, they look eye to eye. It's sort of, we really feel that now he's accepted. And of course, he's given Ali's place to sleep, and he's given a new name. You know, he's going to be called El Orenz. El Orenz. And that's, and Ali says, truly, for some men, nothing is written unless they write it. And actually, you know, in the movie, Lawrence does mention his illegitimacy, and it doesn't seem to, of course, matter to Ali because, you know, Lawrence has proven himself worthy, you know, and that's much more important in a way than who you were bitten. So here we go. He is, and then of course he gets new clothes. The old clothes are gone. He's given the white harith robe. He tries on this new robe, and there's this, you know, amazing shot where the camera comes zooming out, and we see how Lawrence now blends in with everybody. He no longer stands out as this British soldier, and then Lawrence wanders off into the desert. And he starts gazing into his knife, right? Because there's no mirror. He wants to see what he looks like. And he seems to enjoy that image so much. And he smiles and laughs, you know, as if he's like a little kid. He plays with his robe and practices bowing. And, you know, and we see an aspect of Lawrence that, you know, we haven't seen before. You know, previously he's been always very deep in thought, a very stoic kind of face. But it's really quite interesting to see that other character emerge in that moment. And as I understand, some of that was quite improvisational on Peter O'Toole's part. And it was a small moment in the script, and he made something kind of great out of it. So, you know, again, it was like he's so infatuated with this new character and this new idea of what he's going to be. And he's just overwhelmed, even more so than the Klan, you know, accepting him as this heroic character. Let's see. So then, of course, you know, Lowell Thomas. Now, you understand that Lowell Thomas, this was a time in 19, you know, what was it, 16, that America had not joined the war, World War I. And Lawrence was very much wanting, and many, of course, in America were wanting us to come and join the war, get involved, and help the British and our allies. And he was looking for a story to publish. And of course, most of the stories were just the horrors of this trench warfare and this horrible, you know, war that was going on. And he saw in this T.E. Lawrence character sort of a, you know, it was like a perfectly made, you know, a story for him to turn into sort of a, you know, a hero for schoolboys, and really contributed a lot to this sort of legend of this great man and all these wonderful things he did. And again, you know, as we've heard so much in American storytelling, and of course the great Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, you know, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And it did become a fact. And he was very aware of, the camera and posing for the photographs, as you saw, and the impact that was happening. So many, again, great lines and great moments. When they're talking about Aqaba, and he first comes up with this idea that we're going to go there, and everyone tries to explain to him there's no water but we carry, and the camels die, we die, and in 20 days they'll start to die, and of course Lawrence's response is, "There's no time to waste, then, is there?" He had that charismatic leadership vision that clearly did inspire, and that part, of course, is true. And of course, the attack on Aqaba is true. That was that was historically accurate, even though some of the other stories and some of the moments were not. Again, I feel sometimes like I'm almost watching a silent film. There's not tons of dialogue at times. You're really just kind of going swept away by the beautiful images, by the incredible music. It gives it sort of there's a cinematic purity, in the experience of watching this film, where you're not, worrying about dialogue and what the character's feeling, and you're really allowed the time to just get swept away, fully engrossed in the experience of cinema, And of course, the critical moment in all of this is when he finally does get captured by the Turks, and great moment with Ferrara where he goes over and pinches his white skin, and clearly this he does not fit in. He's not an Arab, and he obviously is tortured and perhaps raped, and he snaps, and from that point on, the action is quite chaotic and quite ugly. And I don't think, there's not a lot of dialogue exposition, but I think, you really understand in a sense that, that he, in this search for, identity and solitude, he was so driven by, the madness or the glory, or and there's a self-disgust because, and again, I don't want to project too much into the homosexuality and masochistic tendencies, though there are, stories that the real Lawrence was a true masochist, and had, other, officers beat him, and took pleasure in the pain. And so there's so much subtext coming out of that moment and that scene when he finally does survive. And then, of course, after his survival, he goes back to Cairo and says, "I'm done. That's it. I'm never going back to the desert. I can't do this anymore." It's all over for him. And of course, Allenby does, in the way, authorities do, manages to play on his character and convince him that he should go back, that he needs to go back. Kind of amazing, transition there. What other amazing moments? Of course, ultimately after saving Gazim, he has to kill Gazim. Gazim is the person who, commits the blood feud murder. And, and he's told, "You gave life and then you took it," and that's certainly a very, mythical, godlike, moment for Lawrence. And we see so many images, for example, like when he's walking across the top of the train and we see his shadow kind of covering all the fighters, cheering him on, it's... So, obviously conflicted character. He lies to Faisal. He lies about British intentions. He knows that, the Arabs are never going to have these countries after the war, that this is really, both the British and French have designs. He lies about having gold. He says what he needs to say. Again, a very beautiful romantic part of the movie is his relationship with his two servant boys. There's no direct implication that, he's homosexual, but there's obviously a lot of affection and caring for these two boys. And of course, both of them, he has to watch die. The one who dies in the quicksand, the horrifying moment, and the other boy, of course, is in the bomb blast, and in fact, Lawrence has to kill him. He has to shoot him because otherwise he'd be captured by the Turks. They can't leave him behind. Incredible moments, very, very dramatic moments. So when he comes back, after saying, I want to just disappear and I pray never to see the desert again, something's happened to this guy, right? I mean, look at that incredible scene where they come across the retreating Turks who have just destroyed this village. And, and Ali says to him, no, we're heading towards Damascus. We can just ignore these people. He says, no. And Lawrence, commands this attack, where they take no prisoners and they massacre these retreating Turks. And he's clearly somehow lost himself. And as much as, he came to the desert to become, clean and he seems to be enjoying himself when he kills the man with his pistol. And there seems to be, a lot of conflict around the violence. There's no question about it. What else can I tell you about this? There's so much. Well, let's talk about, again, what happened when it came out. So, upon release, it was huge critical and financial success, though there were a number of critics who did take issue with the fact that historically it was not accurate, that they took a lot of liberties with the story itself, and also the sort of unresolved nature of the character study, where it's not summed up and it's not clear. Was this a hero? Was this a bad guy? Was this, what are we to make of this life? And it was not presented all wrapped up in a tidy package. And I think that could be I think that was incredibly interesting. Of course, it won all the Academy Awards, as we talked about. And ultimately, when we watch this movie, we're left with these questions, that are challenging us, and perhaps, an unknowable subject. And again, regardless of it's the historical figure accurately or not, it's a film about a character, and most films try to ultimately give you some satisfaction after 4 hours or whatever you've spent watching, but this film refuses to do that. So, although, we see all these perils and this enormous journey, it's never been seen on this level. There are these questions that remain. But maybe that's why we keep coming back to it again and again, and why it even feels, not dated and feels somehow contemporary, because there is no happy Hollywood ending. It's, just an enduring, incomparable epic. I was trying to think of movies that, feel similar, and it's kind of unique. So, again, several comments, and certainly, any questions you have, please ask. But yeah, it is important to see this in the big screen. But I think it's just important, in a way, on the small screen this time for me. I found myself more immersed in the character study and less sort of overwhelmed with the spectacle and the action. And I think it seemed, quite interesting to watch this way. But certainly, as soon as the theater opens, we'll be thrilled to show it again. What else? Someone mentioned the trick is not minding that it hurts. Yes, that's a great moment. Again, this idea of how do you marry history and real history and fiction. I think ultimately it was, it's a beautiful blend. And he did something really, really extraordinary, David Lean, and he's certainly one of my favorite directors of all time. And certainly went on to make some other amazing movies, Dr. Zhivago, of course, and then A Passage of India. Even though he did struggle in his later life financing and working. He made a movie, Ryan's Daughter, that was not successful. I mean, the Hollywood industry can be very cruel even to its greatest directors. But I do hope you enjoyed watching it again. And of course, I enjoy watching these movies and talking about them. And we'll be back again next Monday night. And then after that, we're going to have a few other guests who are going to talk about films that they're favored as well. And I always debate about whether to try to find some wonderful obscure movie to talk about, or is it more fun to just sort of explore the classics again. I just saw a question here about why was Ali and Lawrence in the town at all to be captured by the colonels. And because, yeah, I mean, in retrospect, why would you send such a, your head got, you'd send out some scouts, and seems somewhat impractical and unrealistic. And I don't know the answer as to why, except, of course, it makes it a very, very interesting film. Animals in the movie, yeah, I don't think they had the animal protection laws in 1962, certainly not in Jordan. So anyhow, so for next week, again, there's a film that's either number 1 or 2 on every single list. It battles back and forth with Citizen Kane. And of course, that's Alfred Hitchcock's great movie from 1958, Vertigo. And Vertigo is something that is always worth watching again. It has such complexity and a lot of depth and a lot going on. And I certainly think it was Hitchcock's greatest film. And if you're interested, please watch it this week. And I'll be here to talk about it and also, answer questions. And of course, please, join one of our film clubs. We really want to do what we can during this time, this crisis, to engage, our community in film and storytelling. And thank goodness we have this technology that allows us to do it. And I think I got to stop talking. The sun is coming. Oh, what a beautiful sunset. Anyhow, thank you very much. I hope you all stay safe and happy, and I'll see you again next week.